Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Taylor. I am a dual qualified commercial litigation associate with DLA Piper and the president of the Scottish Young Lawyers Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, where we will be lending our focus to the Solicitors Qualification Exam, or the SQE. I sat the SQE in January of this year, and I found out in March that I passed. And although it was a really rewarding process, it was long and at times quite taxing. And I also found it quite difficult to access real life accounts of the process, which is why I wanted to deliver this event. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Gordon Sang, who is a dual qualified commercial litigation associate with CMS, and Rob Mars, who is the head of education at the Law Society of Scotland. Gordon and Rob, I will let you introduce yourselves and perhaps provide a brief insight into your experience of the SQE from a personal and educational perspective. So Gordon, I'll come to you first.
Thanks very much, Patricia. So my name is Gordon Sang. I'm an associate at CMS. I'm in the commercial dispute resolution team and focus mainly on real estate disputes. I'm 5 years PQE, and I did the SQE in January earlier this year, the same time as Patricia, and thankfully found out in March that I had passed the SQE, so very delighted with that result. But I'd very much echo a lot of what Patricia was saying, and that it was a very rewarding but taxing experience, and it was very difficult to find out more information about it, particularly that the SQE had recently replaced the QLTS. So yeah, very happy to be here to share some experiences and hints and tips. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. And Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, and hello to everybody. I'm Rob Mars, as Patricia said, and I head up education at the Law Society. My interaction with the SQE is usually our members getting in touch about something or other, asking, is this really the case, or what do you know about it? Because I've been in the society a while, I've seen the SQE develop, coming out of the LETR, Legal Education Training Review in 2013-14, and they've spent a considerable time developing it and launching it in the last 18 months to 2 years. So it's still very early on in that process, but if I can shed any light from the society's perspective, because sometimes we'll have some knowledge of why they've gone a certain way, I'm happy to share that and try and answer any questions that you have today.
Thank you so much, Rob. And before we begin the panel discussion, I want to encourage you all to post questions into the chat box throughout the event, or at the end. You can take yourself off mute, pop your camera on, and pose questions to us, your panel. I guarantee that if you have a question about the SQE, someone else will be looking to ask the same thing, or looking to ask the same question. So please do use the chat box function. So to kick things off, I think it would be useful for Rob to provide a brief overview of what the SQE actually is and how it applies to Scottish solicitors. So over to you, Rob.
Yeah, of course, that's absolutely fine. So the SQE is the means that the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, uses to assess competence for all of those people qualifying in England and Wales. So the previous system, and Gordon mentioned it before, for those who are qualifying from another jurisdiction, including Scotland, had to do a version of QLTS, a Qualified Lawyers Transfer Scheme. There were some exemptions for Scots, there were more exemptions for Irish lawyers, and there were fewer exemptions for other jurisdictions globally. They then moved to the system of the SQE. I think we'll go into more depth on what that actually entails later on. But what the SQE essentially does is turn it, they don't say this, but it turns it into a bar exam system that everybody, including those qualifying in England and Wales, are required to undertake SQE1 and SQE2. How it applies to Scottish solicitors is you only need to, and I realise only is doing a lot of lifting in that sentence, only need to pass SQE1. You are automatically exempt as a qualified solicitor from SQE2, which is largely skills-based. SQE1 is entirely knowledge and sometimes values based. But that's it. We are now just treated like everybody else in the world. We have some favourable exemptions compared to others, but we can go into that in greater detail. So hopefully that is a useful starting point to kick off the discussion.
It absolutely is, Rob. Thank you so much. And Gordon, could you please tell us a bit about your SQE experience in terms of why you undertook the course, why you decided to undertake the course, and was your employer supportive of that decision? Did they encourage you to do so?
Yeah, so really I wanted to broaden my knowledge to English law for two main reasons. Within the team, we work with a lot of clients in Scotland, but those clients operate in both England and Scotland. So they'll often be familiar with English legal terminology and processes, but not necessarily the Scottish equivalent. So undertaking the SQE allowed me to better understand their perspective, coming from England, when I was explaining Scots law to them, i.e. by drawing comparisons to what they had already understood in terms of English law. Additionally, within the team, we work across the CMS offices across the UK, which includes assisting our colleagues in our English offices. We also have two partners within the Edinburgh office that are English only qualified. And whilst we can take on English work as a Scots qualified lawyer under the supervision of an English qualified partner, undertaking the SQE just gave me a better understanding of the processes involved and also more confidence in taking on those English matters. Moving on to your second question there about whether my employer was supportive of the decision, for the reasons outlined above, they saw the benefit of undertaking the SQE, and they very much encourage the team to do so where possible. I actually indicated that I wanted to do it after the team had set its budget for the year. So that proved a bit more difficult in terms of finding the budget, but the team was supportive enough that they managed to find budget for me to do the SQE that year. So I'd really encourage anyone who wants to do the SQE to indicate it to their employers early as possible so that budget can be allocated accordingly.
Thank you so much, Gordon. My experience was really similar. I decided to complete the course at the time, and as I am now, I'm working at an international firm. Members of the team are already dual qualified and undertaking English work from Scotland. And because I sat with the litigation team during my training contract, it meant that I could support or shadow them on English work at trainee level, and it kind of galvanized that interest to find out more about a different system. Again, my employer was really supportive of the decision. Ultimately, it benefits the business. I had to complete quite an extensive business case document. You might have been similar, Gordon, and that had to highlight why I wanted to become dual qualified, why it would assist my team and the firm. So a tip for that, I just focused on bolstering the English practice that we had already built in Scotland, and the fact that it would better serve Scottish clients as well in the event that they found themselves subject to English proceedings. We could handle that from the north. So after you had decided to complete the course, what did you do next? I guess we're looking to understand the start of the SQE journey. Did you approach a provider? How did you choose a provider? And did you decide on a timescale during which you were going to complete the studying and laterally the exam?
Yeah, so CMS deal with lots of that stuff for us internally. So my first point of call once the budget had been approved was to speak to the relevant people internally in the learning and development team. And they signed me up to the QLTS school, which is a provider for the SQE. The name probably gives it away, but they were also a provider for the QLTS previously as well. And I think that in terms of our firm policy, they are just our go-to provider. So that's the one I went with. I'd also heard good things about QLTS from colleagues who had previously undertaken the QLTS, and so I didn't look at any alternative providers. Once I'd signed up to the QLTS school, we had a quick call with them just to discuss how to go through the materials and what they recommended in terms of timescales. I had pretty much decided that I would give myself 6 months to complete the course. So the exam was in January 2023, and I was just about to finish another course in June 2022, which meant that I had a good solid 6 months from July till January to complete that. And then the QLTS school then recommended that if I was to do it in 6 months, they recommended 16 hours of studying each week for a period of 6 months.
Brilliant. Well done on completing it in 6 months. I gave myself a whole year. So I didn't have a mandatory provider at my firm. I had a bit more latitude there. So after getting sign off from my employer, because I was applying for funding essentially, that's when I approached the provider, but I actually had to choose a provider before submitting my business case. So for those in the audience, just to be aware of that, you might have to do that research in advance of your business case if you're applying for funding, so that your employer can review what's required in respect to the funding. I also chose the QLTS. So I did a bit of research and I looked at the likes of Barbary, I think it was University of Law, but I had actually heard through the grapevine that some firms selected the QLTS as a mandatory provider, CMS being one of them. And I had a look at the materials and I thought it looked really thorough. And the package I signed up for provided pre-recorded lectures, textbooks, mock tests, flashcards for each module, and then sort of set FLK1 and FLK2 tests at the end, which we'll come on to. And I felt like it would cover off different styles of learning and different opportunities to try out the different materials. So that really appealed to me. In advance of today's event, someone actually wrote in and asked whether you need to choose a provider in order to prepare for the exam. I believe that the answer to that is no. You do not need to. I think you could essentially book the exam and rock up and sit it, but Rob will correct me if I'm wrong. However, I think for me, having a provider and seeing the wealth of materials that I had to get through. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting a wee bit of feedback there. 2 seconds. Yeah, so I think for me, having a provider and seeing the wealth of material that I had to get through, it kind of helped me stay on track and reminded me of the extent of the exam. I know people who have done it through complete self-taught via textbooks, but to me, I think having the content there that was recommended that I should cover was so helpful, because otherwise I felt like it would have been quite elusive without the course provider materials. So Rob, coming to you next, is there anything that you would like to add in respect of considerations to make in relation to choosing a provider, or anything that Gordon and I have covered off earlier?
I don't think so. I don't think I can, recommend or anything.
No.
I think it is kind of horses for courses. Some people like one provider, another will like another. It's certainly not mandatory, so far as I'm aware, to have one. I agree with you, Patricia. I think it would be very difficult to do, although, fair play to people who want to bash on without it. I suppose my concern would be you end up saving money in terms of not taking on a provider, but you end up losing time and potentially losing money longer term, and maybe needing resits. So it may be a case of speculating to accumulate. The one thing I would say is this is still very early days of the SQE. We're within the first few sort of tranches of it, and the providers will be getting up to speed, and they'll be taking feedback from those people who are doing it, as well as seeing how their graduates of those crammer courses or provision courses get on. So hopefully they'll get better. And I suppose it's a case of doing some research, a bit of due diligence, a bit of buyer beware, and saying, really looking into, Barbie, QLTS and the others to say, well, who is best for me. The one other thing I would add is, I know both of you are larger cross-border, if not international firms, and that won't be the case for everybody. I'm sure the budget case is similar, although it may not be as set out as it would be at a firm like yours, Patricia. But one thing that we often get at the Society is we get questions from those perhaps not at your size of firm saying, well, what can we do? And, our advice back the way is, if your firm doesn't need you to be dual qualified, it's unlikely to pay for it. There's a clear and obvious business reason for somebody at CMS or DLA or similar. If you're not doing much English work, what you're flagging to your boss there is, well, I'm not sure I see a long-term future here at the firm. So if that's the case, it may end up being self-funding, which of course is a very different analysis for an individual to make from if their employer is making it. So I can't give any tips on how to convince a boss on that, but it's probably worth noting that for those people on the call who aren't at those cross-border international firms, the equation may be slightly different, and it may be that the answer is less positive internally than it was for both of you. I hope it's not, but we have to be alive to the fact it may be.
No, thanks, Rob. I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate your candor there. On the choosing a provider point, I know it sounds a bit funny, but Reddit is actually very good. You know, the site Reddit is like a social media page. If you go on there and you type in SQE along the top, you have different people who've sat the exam during all of the different sittings over the last couple of years, and they're talking about providers and what they found good about their provider and what they didn't. So yeah, that's quite a good practical next step if you're thinking about choosing a provider. So Gordon, after choosing your provider, how did you approach your study and your exam preparation? How much time did you give yourself to prepare for the exam? You said 6 months. Did you focus on textbooks or completing questions? What was your approach?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what you were saying earlier, Patricia, about just having a course and having a wealth of materials available to you. And that really just adds to the weight of how much work has to be done. Certainly for me, when the 18 textbooks arrived in the post in a big box, that certainly made me sit up a bit and think, wow, I've actually got quite a bit to do in the 6 months that I've given myself. So yeah, I gave myself 6 months and I started going through all 18 textbooks. But that probably took slightly longer than I anticipated, mainly because I had different holidays coming up, workload to balance, and it just was a bit more challenging than I'd anticipated. So I think by the time I completed the textbooks, I was already 4 months into my 6 months, and I was doing questions intermittently throughout the textbooks. And then in month 5, I started going through revision material. So for the QLTS, they provided revision notes alongside the textbooks as well. So I went through the revision notes in month 5, and then the final month, my approach changed quite drastically. And when I started doing the mock exams and realized that I just wasn't quite where I needed to be. So in the final month, I really ramped up the studying. I started doing mock exams to identify the areas of weaknesses. And once I'd identified those areas, I started to listen to lectures on those specific areas and then revisiting the textbooks on those points just to solidify my knowledge. And then I just repeat that process. And each time I identify a new weakness, focus on the lectures, revisit the textbooks, and just keep repeating, all the way for 3 or 4 weeks up until the exam.
I approached it really similarly. So as I said before, I actually gave myself just under a year. So I ordered my materials in January 2022 and I sat the exam in January 2023. And for those who might not know, I believe that the exams are January and July each year. So I actually started by making a study timetable, and I'd aimed to complete a topic each week or every 2 weeks. However, like what always happens with these things, that study timetable was updated and changed and delayed more than I would care to admit, as ultimately life and other things do get in the way. But in terms of approaching each module, I actually read the textbook first, back to front, and I tried to consolidate it down into more accessible notes. I probably wouldn't do that if I were to do this process all over again, because I would take much shorter notes to begin with, because when it comes to the last few weeks and you've got screeds and screeds of notes that compared to an equally chunky textbook, it's not that helpful and it can be quite overwhelming. So yeah, I would probably change that up, but still I think reading the textbook was helpful. But I also worked through the relevant lectures at the same time, because what I found was, and this is no slight at the QLTS materials, but there were some things that were mentioned in the lecture that weren't mentioned in the textbook and vice versa. So I got into a bit of a funk of worrying that I was going to miss something. So yeah, I did textbook, lectures, and then at the end of every single module, I would sit the mock test for that module, and not to be confused with the mock tests, which are like combine all of the modules together, like the proper exam conditions. And one thing that I found really useful was I, like Gordon, would take a note at the end of those module mock tests. I'd take a note of all the problem areas that had arisen so that I could focus my attention on those when I would, return closer to the exam. Much like Gordon, closer to the exam, I focused on mock tests and the flashcards and those problem areas. For some modules, I ultimately felt like I had to go through it all again, because I think doing it in a year, which is something to flag, doing it in a year meant that there were some topics that I hadn't really touched upon in months. And by months, it could be like 8 months. So, I think, again, if I could go back, I might be more consistent in updating my knowledge on each module as I went through, but hindsight's a wonderful thing. And then I made a revised study timetable 1 month before the exam, and I would review a module a day. So whether that was flashcards, and then I would do mock tests. And I felt like that helped balance the sort of consolidating the substantive content, but also getting used to the exam technique, because I had never sat an exam like this in my life. And we'll come on to the format of the exam next, but it was very novel for someone who's used to drafting essays and analysing points in full, to be doing a multiple choice test. I think one tip in this regard is you need to find out what works for you, and don't be afraid to change your approach. If you've been employing the same approach for a number of months and then you're like, I'm not taking this in, change it, especially if you've gone with a provider that's given you a wealth of materials. There's options there to change up your study technique. I'm not a mind map or a visual learner. Most of the time I have to learn from repeating things back to me and almost having a discussion with myself about things. But a week before the exam, I just had to, put the notes to the side and get on with doing the mock tests, and getting used to those exam conditions and having a bit of confidence in the work that I had undertaken. And I think also prepare yourself for getting, as Gordon kind of alluded to, getting some below average test results in the first couple of mocks. As I say, we're not used to multiple choice or picking the best answer rather than the right answer, which again we'll elaborate on in a second. So from a practical perspective, Gordon, how did you manage a busy full-time job and studying? What did your week look like at this time? And is there anything you would change about how you approach this demanding project?
Yeah, so when QLTS school originally recommended 16 hours a week, I thought that was quite realistic and probably quite doable. But as the weeks went on, I just realized each week I was really struggling to fit in 16 hours a week. I was experimenting with morning study and evening study just to see what worked best. Personally, for me, I found mornings worked better when I was a bit fresh. I'd wake up a bit earlier and just get some studying in before work. Whereas I found that for the evening slots, I'd get home, have dinner, and I'd just be too tired. I'd be reading the textbooks, but nothing would really be going in and I wouldn't be retaining anything. So yeah, for many weeks, I set different time blocks throughout the mornings and the evenings, mixing between the two, and then moving more towards morning slots during the week, and then making sure that I allocate the time at the weekend where I could block out a good amount of time to study as well. I also found that when I was traveling, either for work or personal life, that was actually a good time to block out some traveling, whether it's on the train to Glasgow for an hour or going down to London and having a 4-hour train ride. That was a really good opportunity to just get a textbook out and just really focus on studying. In terms of anything I would change about how I would approach my studying during that period, I would say I probably spent a bit too long on the textbooks. Like I said, it took me about 4 months to get through them. And by that point, I really should have been starting to test my knowledge. So I think if I was to go back and do it again, I would go through the textbooks a bit quicker, perhaps just skim through them to get an idea of what topics were covered, but not read it, back to back in the way that I did. And then just start testing myself as early as possible so that I could basically do what I did in the final month, which was do mock exams, do lectures, revisit the textbooks over the course of 2 or 3 months instead of condensing it into a stressful 4 weeks.
I had a very similar experience, Gordon. I think we're very much singing from the same hymn sheet. I was quite strict and set very strict boundaries with myself, and I generally kept one free day at the weekend, and would study every day before work. And like Gordon, I would try to study after work, but did find the mornings to be much more productive. I have to say I had a very supportive team and friends and family around me who were aware that I wasn't necessarily going to be as available in the run up to the exam, the last couple of months. And I think it was obviously a more difficult conversation to have with work rather than, you know, your friends and family, because, you know, work know that you're going through this and they want you to do well. But obviously when you're super busy and having to say, it's actually my exam in a month, it can be a bit of a daunting conversation to have, but ultimately they want you to succeed. So yeah, it's easy enough when it comes around. I felt like staying as consistent as possible with my study timetable meant also that I could try and you know, factor studying around my life rather than the other way around. I think if I could change anything, I might do it in slightly less time, rather than over the year. Because as I say, when I went to revisit certain topics, I was like, I can't even remember writing these notes. And I definitely did. So yeah, I'd perhaps maybe do it over 6 to 8 months. But I had chosen to do it over the year because of other commitments such as SYLA, and you know, an exceptionally busy workload. But you know, hindsight, 6 months might have actually been more focused. So yeah, that's what I would review. So after all of the preparation, we come to the exam itself. Rob, could you please provide an overview of the structure of the exam? So how is the exam split? Do all of the sections studied arise, or is it a random selection? And the timescales for completion of each paper?
Yeah, that's fine. So as I say, anyone who's qualified as a solicitor here is automatically exempted from SQE 2, and therefore you need to do SQE 1. Somewhat misleadingly, SQE 1 is actually 2 exams, Functioning Legal Knowledge 1 and Functioning Legal Knowledge 2. The FLK 1 covers a variety of subjects, just to run through those quickly: business law and practice, dispute resolution, contract tort, and then legal system of England and Wales and other administrative law. I won't go into the full thing because it takes about a week to read it out, but that's pretty much what FLK 1 covers. And FLK 2 covers property, wills and administration of estates, solicitor accounts, land law, trusts, and criminal law and practice. In terms of how it's structured, it's difficult to say if everything comes up each time, but SQE 1, both parts, as I say, consist of 2 assessments, and each of those consists of 180 questions, as Patricia's already said. They are multiple choice questions. I'll give a tweak on that as well. Each day is split into 2 sessions of 2 hours 33 minutes with 90 minutes questions, 90 questions in each session. That makes sense. So it should take 2 days to do the exams, if that's my understanding is right. But even within FLK 1 and FLK 2, it's split into 2 with 90 questions each time. What Patricia mentioned before, I think, is really the telling point of this, is that both parts of SQE 1, they talk about a single best answer multiple choice test. And we've heard some feedback, and I'd be interested if Gordon and Patricia felt this as well, that there is a best answer, but some of the answers, you might have 4 options. There might be more than one plausible answer, if that makes sense. It's not like there is a obvious this is correct and then 3 obviously wrong. And I think that will come out very well in the mocks, because as Patricia said, that's a very different way of assessing competence. How we do in Scotland, typically it's either essays or exams, and then when you're in the traineeship, it's largely based on performance. You know, are you performing against an outcome in the view of a qualified and supervising solicitor? But here, that single best answer multiple choice test may be something that you've never really come up against before. And I am certain that if you don't practice, that will be very, very confusing, because you'll look at the 4 options and say, hang on a second, all of those might be the right answer. And I see Gordon nodding, which is helpful. But that is, from the feedback that we get, that's the tricky part. So that's a quick run through of what is covered. It's difficult to say what's going to come up each time, of course, but my guess is that in 180 questions, they're going to cover an awful lot. And that, I don't know how to help you practice for that, but maybe Gordon or Patricia will have an insight into that single best answer, because that's where people might come a cropper.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I completely agree. So I remember in the actual exam in January, there was one particular question where in my head I could argue for every single answer being correct. So yeah, the sort of single best answer thing is completely new to me. In terms of practicing for that, I think the only real practice that will afford you the best chance is to just questions. So with our provider, at the end of each module, as I said, you have mock tests for that particular module. And that can be a bank of maybe 150, sometimes 200 questions on the one module. So it's just on equity and trusts or just on property. But I would go back over those questions and then sit an actual mock, which would merge all of the topics. And that way you've afforded yourself access to numerous example questions. And I don't know what it was, but it just starts to click in your mind that you're like, okay, so that mentions that element, that question doesn't. And you have to be quite, I would say, fixated on the wording. Is it an and or an or? Is there a reasonable in there? It's things like that. It can be quite nuanced, but for me, it was just practicing questions. I don't know about you, Gordon.
Yeah, no, likewise, I agree that it's just about practice, because there were so many occasions, whether on the mock or the actual exam, where I felt that all 5 answers could have been arguable. But of course, you just have to work out the best answer. And I suppose, yeah, going back to your point there, it's just the preparation of doing the mock exams, going back to the textbooks to consolidate any weaknesses or lack of knowledge in a particular area. I also found that in the exam itself, it wasn't just covering the sort of main topics. I remember being quite surprised in FLK2, I think it was, where there's quite a lot of focus on the criminal youth system for the criminal law questions, which when I was looking through the textbooks, I kind of skimmed past that section because it was a small section. I thought they're probably not going to ask anything about that. It's fine. So yeah, I just can't stress enough how important it is to just go through all the preparation.
Yeah, agreed. Because I think that, you would imagine that there would be, how do I phrase this? FLK1, paper 1 is covering X amount of topics, and you'd imagine that there'd be a question for each topic, but I don't necessarily think that it was equally weighted. So there were quite a lot of questions on equity and trusts, and only one or two on property, for example. So there was really no rhyme or reason to it, which was unexpected, and maybe not. It didn't really translate from the mocks that way, but yeah, that's how it was. I don't mean that to sound overly negative, guys, but may as well give you an honest account of the experience.
I think, Patricia, it's worth it. Like, I'm trying to think of an analogy, and the best analogy I can come up with, and realizing I haven't sat the examinations, and frankly I'm never going to, is not because of anything you said. It's kind of like when you're learning to drive. You learn you aim for in a way you aim for the test, and then as soon as you pass the test, you start crossing your hands when you turn a corner rather than push it through. And I think that's kind of the mindset people have got to get into here. This isn't necessarily about practicing in England. Rarely will a client come in and give you a question and say, right, can you answer this one? And I'll give you 5 options that are all quite similar. Rather, it's about getting into the SRA and Kaplan's way of thinking. And as you both said, that the best way to do that is to practice consistently to see how that works. And of course, as more cohorts of SQE examinations go through, you have a greater level of past papers, or even if they aren't there, you have examples of people coming out and speaking about the sorts of things that come up, the sort of things that trip you up. But I think that's the key thing to take away, that single best answer multiple choice, because if you don't get hold of that, that's why we get people ringing us up saying, I failed, but I'm really good. I'm not saying you're not really good. I've got nothing to do with the SRA, but this is how they have chosen to assess competence. So you need to, if you can take that away, I think you'll be in a really good position to excel.
Thank you, Rob. That's really helpful. Gordon, could you please provide an overview of the exam day itself? You know, what was the assessment centre like, etc.?
Yeah, and I'm glad you've asked that, because that was actually one point that really threw me off. I've already mentioned my prep throughout those 6 months and really driving up the prep in January, to the point that, you know, by the time the exam came round, I felt ready for the exam. But what I wasn't ready for was the assessment centre itself. So of course, I'm going to caveat by saying that I can only speak from my experience in the Edinburgh Test Centre. So the assessment centres are usually the test centres that are used for the driving theory tests. So if you've done one of those nearby, it probably will be that same venue. In terms of my experience in Edinburgh, it was quite a stressful environment, and there were a lot of things I just hadn't anticipated. In my head, I thought I would just go in, sit down, do the exam, walk out, and then repeat after lunch. But there was actually quite an extensive ID check, whereby our IDs were checked about 3 times throughout the process, and you really felt like you were being interrogated almost just to sit the exam. There were also a few rules about the assessment itself, which I hadn't been aware of prior to the exam, which were: 1, if you wanted water, you weren't allowed to take your own water with you. You had to put your hand up and ask the invigilator for water. They would then bring you a cup of water, watch you drink the water, and then take the water away. If you went in with a jumper on, they would need to check your sleeves. And if you wanted to take your jumper off because you were too warm during the exam, again, you had to put your hand up. The invigilator would come over, they would escort you outside, you'd remove your jumper, and they would escort you back in. Likewise, if you were too cold, you had to put your hand up, the invigilator would take you out, and you would get some additional clothing from your locker. So there was a point, I think, just before we went into the exam, where all the candidates had to stressfully decide whether to wear a jumper or not into the exam to avoid wasting time putting their hands up. Another point about the assessment centre that threw me off was just actually staring at the screen for the 2.5 hours straight. When I was doing the mock exams, I was quite strict in terms of the timings, but at the end of the day, I was doing it in the comfort of my own living room or the comfort of my own kitchen, where in between questions, I might just sit back, look out the window, maybe even stretch my legs a little bit. Whereas the exam conditions aren't quite like that. You're expected to stay in your seat the entire time. You are boxed in, so you can't see either side of you. So you really are just focusing on the screen in front of you, which I just found really tiring on the eyes. And there was also a timer that was counting down throughout the exam, which also just added to the stress. I think for me, that made the first exam much more difficult. I think we've already touched on it. There's 2 exams for the SQE1, FLK1 and FLK2. FLK1 was on the Thursday, and then FLK2 was on the following Monday. And I think, having gone through the experience on the Thursday, it was much more comfortable going on the Monday, knowing exactly what to expect. But certainly I found FLK1 to be a much more stressful experience and had to deal with many other stresses beyond just the assessment itself.
I completely agree, Gordon. I can confirm that the Glasgow Test Centre was not dissimilar to your Edinburgh Test Centre. Ours was so strict that a gentleman wasn't allowed to take eye drops in and have those on his desk. So again, I don't think anything could have really prepared you for that, because they're not going to tell you that in your briefing documents or your textbooks, which is an added stress. Sorry, I don't know why this little thumbs up keeps appearing for me, especially when I'm talking myself. That seems a bit arrogant. Right, sorry. So yeah, I completely agree, and I wish someone had told me that in advance, how strict it would be. And if I could go back and practice, I would probably set up much more stringent exam conditions. Another thing that I noticed was that the timer was different. So with our provider, the QLTS, the timer ran like in hours and minutes, I think, but the timer in the actual exam ran in minutes. So when I went in and I saw that, I had to try and break down, I'll do X amount of questions in X amount of minutes rather than the way I had been doing it before. So yeah, just practical tips to be aware of. And so after you receive your results, and congratulations again for passing, what do you have to do next in order to practice English law?
So there's a few checklists to go through on the SRA website, where you have to basically verify your degree. You have to get a few checks in terms of good character and things like that. But essentially, it's just a checklist just to work through, that isn't too difficult to get through. It just takes a bit of time. And one thing I learned the hard way was just that the SRA website isn't always fit for purpose, and sometimes I just follow up with the SRA directly when I'd already verified my details, but the website was telling me that I still needed to do that, but wouldn't let me do it because I'd already done it.
Thanks, Gordon. And Rob, in the event that it's not a pass first time round, what are the options to reset?
Yeah, that's fine. So hopefully this is all irrelevant for you all. But basically the clock starts ticking from the day you sit your first SQE assessment to complete the entire SQE. But in all of Scotland's cases, unless you're qualifying before you qualify, if that makes it. If you're trying to re-qualify before you qualify, which let's not even go there. You have 6 years from the date you first sat an assessment to complete the entire SQE. So you've got 6 years to do it. If you fail FLK1 or FLK2 at the first attempt, you have 2 further attempts in that 6-year period. If you fail it 3 times, you can't do anything in those 6 years. You have to wait until a new 6 years begins, if that makes sense. And obviously you can't, and why would you, book a resit before you've got your results? They're very keen on saying that in the exam. I mean, I'm not an optimist, but I don't think I've ever thought, I'm pretty optimistic, but I don't think I've ever be that so pessimistic that I would try and book something before I'd even found out the result. The other key thing is the cost. So that is changing in September marginally, but if you fail one of FLK1 or FLK2, you have to reset the one you failed, obviously, and as of September, it'll be just short of £900. I think it's 899 to reset as of September. Before September, it's slightly less, like 810 or something. If you fail both FLK1 and FLK2, obviously you've got to pay both fees. So that's all it is. You get 3 goes at it. You have a 6-year time period for those 3 goes. If you fail 3 times, you have to wait for a new go, and you have to pay each time, if that makes sense. But you don't have to if you fail FLK1 and pass FLK2, you don't have to resit the one you passed. You just have to resit the one.
Thank you, Rob. That's really helpful.
Sorry.
So SQE1 split into FLK1 and FLK2, and FLK1 and FLK2 are further split into 2 papers each. So if you fail one paper in FLK1, you have to reset all of FLK1, or does that go to an average grade? I should know this. I've just done it.
I don't know that, actually. I would think it would come down to what the overall was in FLK1. I don't think it would be the first 90 questions. I think it would be marked on the whole 180.
Yeah,
I think that's the only way it can be done. So yeah, that logically that has to be the case. I know there's questions, but just because one came in earlier on, somebody mentioned about exemptions. The answer, like, everybody comes to us and says, can you get us exemptions? And the SRA is a separate regulator. I can make representations, but ultimately they are reticent to do so. Their view is they want everybody to be assessed in the same way across SQE1 and SQE2, and we've already been exempted entirely out of SQE2. And their view is, as soon as you begin to exempt people from bits of SQE1, all of a sudden you're not actually comparing like with like across the whole band. So they are loath to do that. I think the only way that we could ever do that is if we could evidence that our knowledge subjects and practice were the same as in England and Wales. And their view is, although they don't quite put it like this, you spent the last 314 years telling us you were a separate, unique and distinct jurisdiction, and now you're telling us you're not. And then they start pointing at the actual differences. Well, criminal's different, conveyancing's different, tort's different, and that becomes more difficult. So exemptions are hard, and I would say it's almost worth putting exemptions to one side rather than obsessing about exemptions, because some people who come to us do, I think, get to the point of obsessing about exemptions. The better way of thinking about it is extremely unlikely that we'll be successful. We've been trying to push for them for years, and we were very pleased we were the first jurisdiction to get SQE 2 knocked off. Others have followed, which is good for them. But it's almost worth thinking, actually, this is a separate jurisdiction. I am choosing to qualify there. Nobody is making anybody qualify there. And these are the requirements that are set out. And therefore, I want to pass. I realise that can be frustrating. I realise it'll be easier with the exemptions, but the SRA's view is pretty much played with a straight bat. So would an English dual qualifying LLB, I know that's come up, be helpful? Of course it would. But an English LLB doesn't exempt English students from SQE 1. So I would move on from exemptions as a general rule and think about getting in the mindset of passing the exam.
Thanks, Rob. I can confirm I was one of those people that obsessed about their exemptions, and it didn't do me any good.
I wasn't going to say that.
Fine, I'm honest. We have a couple more questions prepared, but I actually think that it would be useful to start working our way through the chat box now. So I've had a direct question. Are you required to do both SQE 1 and SQE 2? Not if you are Scottish qualified. Rob, give me a...
Totally, yeah, spot on. If you're a Scottish solicitor, you're exempt from SQE 2.
Thank you. So Charlene has asked, how many years PQE do you think is advisable before you undertake this qualification? Gordon, you mentioned you were 5 years qualified. Do you think that made it an easier course for you, having that practical experience over a number of years?
Yeah, I think it definitely helped. In terms of how many years I would think are advisable, speaking personally, my first year as an NQ I found was quite a steep learning curve. And given just how demanding this course is, I can't imagine me coping well being an NQ and doing the prep at the same time for the exam. I would probably say anytime 2 years PQE and beyond would be ideal, bearing in mind your sort of work commitments as well. Because I think in my second and third year PQE, I was just so busy at work that again, I just wouldn't have been able to undertake this course. And it's only when I was 4 years PQE that I had a bit of a lull in my workload that I was able to then take on this within the 6 months that I did. But I definitely do think that the experience I already had prior to doing it helps with the course.
Thank you, Gordon.
I would just jump in. I mean, I think Gordon is entirely spot on. I think it would come down that NQ transition is very important in a solicitor's career. So I wouldn't advise messing about with that, moving from the traineeship, because lots of people want to qualify as quickly as possible, and that's entirely understandable. And of course, some people will do it. The only exception, rather, that I would see to Gordon as example is if you are one of those people who has done an English law degree, because if you are practicing in Scots law and you're doing Scots law, all you'll be thinking about is Scots law. So if you are one of those people who was at Strathclyde, Aberdeen or Dundee and doing dual qualifying, and you have the time, that's the key thing, and you have the time to do it, that knowledge combined with getting your head in the right place about the single best answer may be particularly useful, because knowledge degrades if it's not used. But in general terms, I think everything Gordon said for everybody else is entirely spot on.
Thank you, Rob. So I actually went the other way, and I applied to do this course when I was 1 year PQE, and I sat it. I'm currently 2 years PQE, and that was challenging. And I agree that I don't think I would have liked to have done it during my NQ year. However, I am glad that I did it when I did, because I'm doing a lot of English work now at my new firm. So I suppose it can be quite personal to you, but I can absolutely confirm that, you know, a couple of extra years of qualification under your belt is only going to benefit you during that process. So I think Antonia's question has been answered. So next question that's come direct to me. There are 3 packages on the QLTS website: SQE1 Basic, Advantage, and Premium. Do you know which one you guys did? I went with Advantage, which is the middle one. I didn't go with Premium. Were you the same, Gordon?
Yeah, I was the same. So I think the key for me was having access to mock exams. And
Yes.
from memory, the difference between the two was that Premium gave me access to a tutor, but the mock exams were the same. And I think that's all I really wanted, was to have a wealth of mock exams before the actual exam.
I agree. And I think that the people who I know who went for a tutor are people who had to sit SQE2, which is the more practical side of things. I don't know anyone who, not to say you shouldn't do it, but I don't know anyone who is exempt from SQE2 that went for a tutor. So I was the same as Gordon, just wanted access to loads of mock papers. This is a good question, actually. What are the additional commitments as a result of being dual qualified? For example, are there 2 lots of CPD to be done? Rob?
Do you want me to do that one?
Yes, please.
That's fine. So in England, there are actually no formal CPD requirements. They have a system called continuing competence. And what that means is that each individual solicitor defines annually what they need to do to remain competent. My old CEO summed up the difference between our approach and their approach as they have an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, whereas we tend to put a fence up at the top in terms of regulatory approaches when it came to learning. And I think there's something in that. If you're at a large firm like the other 2 speakers are, that's kind of irrelevant, because they'll put on so much internal CPD for you that you know, you smash through our requirements and you would automatically meet, you know, the continuing competence requirements. So it's just a different regulatory approach. And so in terms of that, there would be no additional requirements. There may be additional fees depending on how you arrange things. So some people who are dual qualified are also dual practicing, so they take out dual practicing certificate on both sides of the border. I would guess for most of the medium and large size firms, that's an additional cost the business bears rather than the individual, although at a smaller level that may fall on you. 10 or so years ago, before the SQE existed, a number of what was D&W, but now Gordon's firm CMS, they would have a system where they would say basically dual qualified. They had English qualified on their CV or on their email, but they didn't say English practicing. And it was almost a reassurance to English clients, although they were dealing with the Scottish solicitor, it did say English there. So in terms of the additional costs and so forth, it's really difficult to say. It depends on what you need to do. If you need 2 PCs, of course, that will cost more money because there's 2 regulatory costs. But in terms of CPD, I can say anything that you do in England would count in Scotland, and the other way would be the same because you define competence in England yourself.
Thank you, Rob. That's really helpful. I think the next 2 questions regarding self-study and minimum level of PQE have since been covered. Sarah has asked, apologies if I've missed this, can you do FLK1 and FLK2 at different times? So for example, FLK1 in January and then FLK2 in July.
I have no idea. I've never been asked before. Gordon, do you have an idea?
I can't remember actually. I think when I signed up, there was the option to sign up to one or the other, but I mean, at the time, I just signed up to both and didn't question it. So I'm not sure if I did sign up to one, would it prevent me from proceeding? So I'm not sure if you have to sign up to both and only sign up to one if you're resitting. So no, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. That's something I need to find out. I'm sorry, Sarah, I didn't know that one.
Sarah, if you want to send in your email address to me directly in the chat box, we can follow up on that particular question for you. Laura has asked, what approximate costs are involved in engaging a provider such as the QLTS?
I just went onto the QLTS website just there. I've just copy and pasted that into the chat. So it's all looking around sort of £2,000 to £3,000.
And you know that I think that's an important point to raise, and thank you for doing that so quickly, Gordon. Because one, you know, even if you're at a large firm and they're paying that is going to be a chunk of the development budget each year, and you know, obviously they gain benefit from that. So it's not just a cost. There is a financial benefit, hopefully short term as well. But if you are one of the people who's self-funding, you know, that is a punchy amount of money. So it's worth looking around, worth making sure you get the right package. I've heard great things about Reddit, not just from Patricia, but others in the process, and they've learned a lot there. So it might be worth getting on there. But, you know, I've got no interest in keeping you all in Scotland. You know, I want you to have brilliant careers wherever it is they may be. What I do have an interest in, though, is making sure you if you are spending your own money, you get value for money and you're not out of pocket, particularly, you know, at a time when the economy isn't in as good a shape as it may be.
Thank you, Rob. Daryl is seeking to clarify, is it 3 FLK1s, 3 FLK2s you can attempt, or is it 3 attempts of SQE1 as a whole?
I think it's 3 of both. Like, so you would get 3 resets of each part. Hopefully, Daryl, it doesn't come to that. But that's my understanding. So if you were to fail FLK1 and FLK2, you'd have 3 goes at both of them. Hopefully you would pass them both the second time, but if you pass one of them the second time, you would have another, if that makes sense. You know, they're not tied in that way. The other thing I was just going to say, because I know this is hopefully helpful for people, but the difference between premium and advantage, and you both went for advantage, is a mentor or study support. Again, you know, I've got no skin in the game here, but there is an increasing number, or there are an increasing number of Scottish solicitors who have passed these exams. I'm consistently heartened by the membership's desire to help the next generation. So I would look for somebody in Scotland who can help you. That might be somebody in your firm, it might be somebody via the SYLA, it might be someone else elsewhere. But you know, it might try 3 or 4 coffees is going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than the 500 extra pounds. So I would advise doing that. But if you've got the money, do it. But you know, you may be able to get great insight from people like Gordon or Patricia or any of the other people who've passed it, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to help.
I absolutely agree. On that note, the SYLA has, with the help of Rob and Ryan McCaig, who is a solicitor with Shepherd and Wedderburn and is currently undertaking his SQE prep, and we've set up an SQE support group. It's just a WhatsApp group, nice and simple, but people can post in questions or queries or materials. So if anyone's interested in joining that, the sort of prerequisites for joining the group are that you're going to take the exam in the next year, just so we can keep the group focused on those who are currently studying. But if you're interested in joining that group, please just message in to mail@syla.co.uk and I will get you added. And yeah, my door is always open if anyone has any questions to save them £500 in getting an advantage package from the QLTS. Someone has asked, are either of you dual practicing, and if not, do you intend to become in the future? So yes, I am. I do English work from the comfort of Edinburgh, which is great. What about you, Gordon?
Yeah, no, similarly, but I would say now that I do have the dual qualification, it's just given me more confidence to take on additional English work, whereas previously I would just feel a bit nervous, or I'd always have to caveat to say, oh, I'm actually just Scots qualified, so I'll need a bit more hand-holding, whereas now I think when opportunities arise, I just have more confidence to take on more English work.
Absolutely.
I've
Rob,
just
were you going
remembered,
to say
Patricia.
something there?
Yeah, somebody, I don't know what, because I know we're coming up for time, I think, but somebody, I'm sure you emailed on a question that had come in before. I was
Yes,
going to
I've
answer
got the
that.
list. I've got the list here.
Okay,
Was it
sorry.
do the speakers have any advice as to how to make the leap and escape south as a future NQ?
Yeah, it was. I
Yeah,
remember the word.
from
It
our
was.
rural trainee.
I remember the word escape. That's why I was. I don't know why that came to mind, but I remembered it. But do I have any? So the question is, do the speakers have any advice on how to make the leap and escape south as a future NQ? This is from a trainee in a rural firm. So, I mean, yeah, the if you really want to go to England, there are two ways to do it. One is to move south and practice on a Scottish practicing certificate. That is perfectly possible. You would just need to work in the city or somewhere like that, and you would have the words on your email header, solicitor brackets Scottish qualified. That's perfectly possible if you're not working in the reserved areas. And for many years, that's what some people in the city have done, because if they're not working in the reserved areas, it was unnecessary. If you do want to go down the SQE route, the last hour hopefully has been helpful for you. I suppose the big question I have, and if you need to get in touch with me away from this, I'm very happy to help if you're on the call, is what are you looking to do? Are you moving from rural Scotland to rural England? Well, that's one thing. If you're trying to move from rural Scotland to, one of the city mega firms, that may be a challenge. Or there may be opportunities in Scotland to sort of make that a leapfrog. So happy to help away from that. But Gordon, Patricia, you may have thoughts as well.
No, I don't have anything further to add, Rob. I thought that was really helpful, and thanks for taking the time to answer that question. There's one more come through in the chat box, and that is, does a partner at your firm need to be dual qualified for you to practice? I don't know the answer to that. I sit in a team where the partner and the senior associate who I work under are dual qualified in England and Wales. And obviously I have access to a London team or a Birmingham team, etc., in terms of supervision.
No, you wouldn't need to be.
No.
I mean, to be fair to the SRA, they are remarkably laissez-faire. I mean, it might not seem like that when they're checking your eye drops going into an exam, but they are. What I mean by that is any degree. If you were just going to do the SQE now, any degree is a qualifying degree for the SQE. A politics degree. I'm not doing politics degrees, and I picked on it because I have one. But that any degree would get you in there. Qualifying work experience rather, can be voluntary work. It can be work undertaken in Scotland. It can be work undertaken not under the supervision of an English solicitor. So I think it would be pretty odd of them to be so laissez-faire all the way through and then say, but when you're qualified, you need to work under an English solicitor. So no, and we do see that quite a lot where people move to Scotland often for love. Their partner is here and they move here and they just work in a Scottish law firm, and then they become dual qualified the other way, become a Scottish solicitor, and they'll just say dual qualified. But do they ever get English work? Well, maybe they get the odd bit of bob, but I don't think so. I couldn't see why you would need to.
That's really useful, and perhaps opens up some doors for the person who's asked the question. So that's good.
Totally.
I have posted the Sila mailbox into the chat box. If anyone has any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch or message me on LinkedIn, or I can put you in touch with Gordon and Rob. I'm sure they would not mind, because as I said at the beginning, the reason that we wanted to host this event is because it was quite difficult to access real life experience of the process. So I hope that we have been able to deliver that to you today. So it's just left me to extend a massive thank you to Gordon and Rob for joining the SYLA today. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for being such an engaged audience, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Cheers.
Everyone.
Good to see you. Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Patricia.
Bye.
Bye now.